They are our protection against cyber cutters or when some board has geo-blocked a great clip. NordVPN will help you get through the straight bat of any rights restrictions so that you can watch all the cricket you want. We aren't always happy with the pitches that we're on. Sometimes we just need a change. NordVPN can drop in a new surface to your location so that your IP address is always ready to score. So if you need to get around the internet's rules, select NordVPN. And so they can do things like help you watch a game on a cheaper stream in another country. So give NordVPN the ball and let them penetrate the vast internet issues you might have. So if you need a VPN, certainly go Nord. Use nordvpn.com/Kimber, K-I-M-B-E-R, to get a huge discount off your NordVPN plan plus 4 additional months for free. Also, you can receive 20 gigabytes of a Sally data voucher as well. The link to all of this is in the show notes. Protect your computer like the fastest, nastiest, scariest bowler in the world is coming for it with NordVPN today. That's nordvpn.com/KIMBER. Go Nord today.
Welcome everyone to Wagon Wheel. I am Jarrod Kimber. That's the name of the show. It's a podcast about cricket where we answer questions about cricket for people who ask questions about cricket. The best way to do that is via Patreon. That is patreon.com/Jarrod Kimber, and you can sign up there and you can get a guaranteed question every week, or you can hang around for the YouTube and do super chats and try some of those. So let's see how we go with the Patreon questions to begin with. As Bloody Bogger says, did the legacy of amateurism help keep parity between cricket nations? On the surface, it's quite strange. England has never had a dominant team post-World War II, but it makes a bit more sense when you consider that amateurism was artificially very strong in England. Had England not shied away from professionalism, it would have taken other teams significantly longer to defeat England. I mean, in some ways, England was the most professional side, bloody. So I don't think that follows at all. Like, if you look at they were paid to play cricket in an era when no one else was. Even the amateurs had certain perks and everything else. So I find that hard to believe that amateurism was holding them down. What I would say is that cricket in England was run for county cricket. And I think if you look at the vast majority of the rest of the countries around the world, cricket was run for international cricket. And that's because county cricket made a lot more money than first-class cricket did in other places. I think that's the bigger issue for me. And then they were probably, the West Indies and Australia from 1975 through to 2005 were professionals in different ways, but were professionals. And then suddenly when you had a professional setup, you saw the difference. So I would say that everyone was kind of amateur, even if England cricket was slightly better, but it was focused on something else. Rudra says, why didn't Alex Doolan play more for Australia? 4 tests with an average of 23 isn't a very good record, but a high score of 89 on a tough pitch against an excellent South African side. I was there for that. Yeah, it was a good knock, but there was no stage where I thought in that knock, oh, this is a guy that should play more test cricket. You compare it to Marcus Harris. My guess is that Marcus Harris averages about 40 as an opener and has spasmodic periods where he's really good at making runs. My memory of Alex Doolan was he averaged 32 or 33. The fact that he even played a test for Australia with a batting average that low is remarkable. He just never consistently made runs. And he had a little spurt which got him into the side. And that was pretty much it for his entire career. He never developed. I think he certainly had batting talents, but I don't think he ever quite brought them out. It'd be really interesting to talk to him about that. But I think he played more tests than he probably should have for a person who was averaging in the low 30s in first-class cricket. Ian says, reports widespread about the 100 becoming a T20 competition, but the ECB wanting to retain the name the 100. If this did happen, could you think of a more nonsensical name for a cricket competition in history? Well, it's no Georgie Pye Super Slam, is it? Yeah, it probably is a stupid name. I'm not sure. It's, I mean, cricket's had a lot of cigarette names in the past of tournaments as well. So it depends on where you factor all those in. It does feel odd to me that they want to keep the name the 100 and change it from a not to 120 balls, which I think most of us said was the logical conclusion to this quite early on. It's always seemed a little bit random. The problem is that too much of this was set up as a marketing gimmick, which, don't get me wrong, they needed to be better with PR and marketing and all those sorts of things because England cricket had fallen behind. But they hadn't really thought of the very basics of Like, it didn't need to be 100 balls. I think the 120 would have been an interesting name. If they wanted to give it a different name and sex it up a little bit. They really got sucked in on their own Kool-Aid. They thought that everyone was going to have a 100-ball competition, everything would change, whereas the rest of the world was like, it's 20 balls shorter. And the rest of the world didn't even want their games to be shorter. England's the only place that thought we'll get more fans if it's slightly shorter. Anyway. Oh, I've already done that one. Josh says, setting aside logistical infeasibility, financial infeasibility, and the fact that the ICC cannot run a proper test league, how would you find a 9-test WTC finals interesting where each nation hosts one match? Would certain teams have pitch advantage? I mean, yes, I suppose. What's the issue that you would have with that? Look, it's fine. I just think that in Test cricket, we should be playing multiple Test matches. So I don't know about, a series of that kind of nature. But yeah, I suppose it's probably better than what we have now. What happened to Tim Southee's bowling? Now, I remember this question coming in. I remember thinking to myself, do you know what I should do? I should look at Tim Southee's numbers. But, I mean, without looking at anything, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that Tim Southee's really old. And let's have a look. 2028. So, 2028. Don't know how I went into the future there. Let's have a look. So, he averages 19, 29, 17, 23, 38, 27. So his age 33 season, he's averaging about 40. Last year, he played 7 Test matches, takes 24 wickets at 27, so a bit of a bounce back. And that other one, I think there's some Tests in India in that as well, which probably, am I right? No, I'm not right. So 2022, he averages 38. That's the baseball summer, so he does get hammered a bit there. And he also, that's the series against Bangladesh. That doesn't go particularly well for New Zealand. And he's got 1 Test in Karachi. Yeah, so there are signs from in his age 33 season that he's struggling. Age 34, he bounces back. And then age 35, he's taken 6 wickets in 4 matches so far this year. I just think he's probably older. But having said that, could just be that he's captain and he's playing through injuries. It could just be that he hasn't got the wickets. You'd have to, if you really want to have a look at that, you'd have to have a look at the full thing. I have seen before, though, times in his career, if you look at, where are we? So in 2013, 2014, and 2012, he averages 22, 24, and 26. And then he averages 37, 31, and 30 the next few years. And around 2018, he works out the wobble ball, right? My point being is that there have been times before where I think he's dropped off in pace. And generally when he drops off in pace, because he's not particularly quick, teams can get on top of him. People now use their feet better to put bowlers of Saudi space than they've had before. But yeah, it could just be that he's really old. Nadika says, occasionally some of your videos get a comment section that is full of ultra-nationalistic furor. Is this concerning when this happens, or are you used to it as a cricket journalist? Yep. I mean, pretty much from day one of being a cricket journalist. You get very used to that, especially being an online cricket journalist. I remember, and I've talked about this before, when the newspaper writers, especially from the UK, but UK, Australia, even India, came online for the first time and started going on Twitter and realized how people thought about them and what people said about them, and specifically realized that they were no longer writing for their local audience in the way that they once had. It was really fascinating to watch that happen. Whereas on my blog, Cricket with Balls, you're talking about the second or third piece was probably taken over that. Most of the pieces were probably taken over that. And you go back to the history of Cricinfo, it was also built on these arguments. A lot of the history of Cricinfo was built on arguments between Indian and Pakistani fans. Now, the other guys who built Cricinfo will say things like, oh yeah, that was annoying and that got in our way and everything else. But it meant that people knew that everyone there cared. And so it kind of worked. And there was plenty of other West Indies fans being angry and Australian fans being angry and everything else. But so that's always happened. Look, I don't necessarily believe all that much in nationalism. Yeah, I was watching the other day, I think it was the canoe slalom in the Olympics. And I'm not sure where she was from. Maybe she was a Czech canoeist who was going up against the Australian, and in the last lap she missed a a gate, which meant that Jessica Fox won the gold. And obviously, as an Australian, that was very nice. But I was more sad that the Czech person had lost, like, because I was just like, she didn't get a chance to give herself her best. You know, she was the one person who could have beaten Fox or gone right down to the line, and wasn't able to do it. I think I've got that story right. Anyway, so obviously, I don't feel about nationalism the same way that many other people do. I've gone into that many times before. So when I see ultra-nationalistic furor in the comments, I usually just laugh at it because it's stupid. And we know it's stupid. There are many people born in the same country that have absolutely nothing to do with each other. I saw a really interesting one, another one in the Olympics the other day, when there was an Australian coach who had worked with another country's swimmers. And he wished them luck and, said, hope they beat the Aussies, sort of as a, still rooting for them kind of thing in this interview. And the Australian coach called it un-Australian. It's un-Australian to support athletes that you formerly coached. Like, it's just this nationalistic nonsense that people come up with. It's not for me. So when I say it in the comments, it's annoying, but I also know that it's part of writing about what is a very nationalistic sport, right? Like, I can't write, overthrowing cricket's empire and then pretend that nationalism hasn't played a huge part in cricket. It may not be what I love, and it may not be what is important to me, but to a lot of people, this is very important. And so it's out there. Generally, when people get nationalistic, it just becomes stupid, right? And so it's easy to sort of ignore it. From my perspective, we have to deal with a few different things here. I have to deal with the fact that this is really a sport that is no longer dominated by Australian English, concerns. And I am a white guy who happens to be an Australian who lives in England, right? So I am going to be the target for a lot of people who quite often won't even look at what I do and just decide it's wrong. Also, I have to understand that a lot of the way that cricket has been covered in the history of the game has been from an English view and then a bit of an Australian view. So it's my job to actually go out and uncover the other stories and redress some of that balance as a historian and all these other things. But it's also my knowledge that a lot of people don't care about what I'm doing or whatever else. I'm just another factotum. Not factotum, another facsimile of a white guy talking about cricket, so they automatically don't like it. And then you've got other people who don't listen anyway. They're just looking for positive things about whatever nation they come from, right? How are you supposed to deal with that, right? That's not my job to deal with that. My job is to talk about cricket. And the people who are going to argue about nationalism are going to do that whether it's on my post or someone else's. That's just the truth. So we have to deal with that. Then we have to deal with, Bayram, who is a Canadian Pakistani who obviously can't say anything about India, even positive about India, without being attacked. It's funny, here's a little story about Bayram. He was trying to get, or when he was in the UK, a friend of his, or might have even been a cousin of his, was trying to get him an Indian shirt that he bought because he really liked the Indian shirt from the last World Cup. And he wanted that sent over to England so he could take it home. At the same time, he's being accused of being anti-Indian on every single show that we do. I get emails about it and all sorts of things. And it's like, there's nothing you can do for those sorts of people. They don't see the world in any sort of normal way, right? They are completely within a cult of their own making. Nationalism and borders are lines drawn up at random by old dudes that have nothing to do with the way that we live our lives anymore. Good luck being excited or angry about those sorts of things. Aditya says, Pete Cummins versus Viv Richards in Australia. It would have been... I wonder if that's not the best matchup for Cummins versus Richards, because you probably want more sideways movement, I would have thought, to take down Richards. So who would be a better modern bowler? I wonder what Anderson would have been like against Richards. Or Steyn more than Cummins. So I'll probably give that one to Richards. Peak Ponting versus Bumrah in Australia. Peak Ponting versus Bumrah in Australia. I feel like I haven't seen enough of Bumrah bowl at the moment in Australia. And also, it's a tricky one, that one, because Bumrah's got a weird action and we never really saw Ponting go up against anyone else in that action. Pick Lara versus Ashwin in India. I mean, if it's on modern pitches, Even Lara's not doing very well. So I talked to Lara a little bit. I don't think he played a great deal of test matches in India. And he said that the spinners he found hardest were the quicker spinners. So he found Kumble, and there was someone else he mentioned, a little bit harder than he did Murali and Warne. So even though those spinners are better, it's because he wanted to use his feet. I think Ashwin would be a very hard person to use his feet. The other problem with this particular one is we don't know how Lara would have adapted to DRS. And he didn't have to do that in that era. But it would have been fantastic. Which is the best one to watch? I kind of would like to watch Lara versus Ashwin the most, but probably Cummins versus Richards is the best one. Vivek says, which women cricketer walks into their country's men's team any day? Sophie Eccleston? I mean, no one. There isn't a woman cricketer who walks into the side like that aren't on that level. Sophie Eccleston is amazing, but I think I'd have to go back and look at her speeds. I think she'd just be too slow for men's international cricket. And then you've got the fact that she's bowling with a smaller ball. So would she be able to get the same amount of rotations with a bigger ball? Well, no, right? I mean, we all know that. So she wouldn't be the same bowler. But if you're talking about, but I was thinking about this from a different point of view of like, there's a few women's cricketers who I think would be really, really important to their men's teams if they could play at that level. So Marizan Kapp could have taken over from Jacques Callis, which I thought was a really interesting one. And of course, Laura Wolfart would walk in to the South African team and probably be their best batter at the moment, right, in the test side. So those are two really interesting ones. Obviously, Chamari would probably be captain of the Sri Lankan men's team and do whatever she wanted with it. The star, the captain, maybe she would coach it. The difference of level that she has compared to a lot of the Sri Lankan men. Amelia Kerr would be really important for the New Zealand side, was another one that I was thinking. Trying to think if there's any others I'm missing out there. Well, Natsiva Brunt probably fits into what the England men's team are doing. And obviously, over any period of time, Elise Perry would have been quite handy for the Australian team as well. And you probably throw whichever leg spinner you want, but or Jess Jonathan, Alana King, whoever into the men's team. But purely on talent, obviously, it's just a different game. And they also, women's cricket develops in a way that wouldn't help Sophie Eccleston when she was playing against men. Patrick says, do you think there's a resistance to non-ex-player commentators? And if so, is that just nepotism or is it something more? Yeah, I've covered this a fair bit before. Most of the broadcasters in the world just want so most of the broadcasters, and we're talking above the producers usually. In my conversation with the producers and the directors and the decision makers, they're just told, get famous ex-players in here. All right? So that's where it starts from, and those are the people with the money. Now, what that means is we haven't really developed the next Harsha Bogle, right? So Mark Howard is a fascinating one because he kind of has slipped in the side door and has managed to do a very, he wasn't really on the circuit in a way that, let's say, I'm trying to think of someone else, like Alan Wilkins was on the circuit, or Andrew Leonard from Ireland is on the circuit. Mark Howard was he did Big Bash, and then he did a little bit of the CPL, had his podcast, which I think was an important thing as well, to show he was a cricket guy, not just someone who commentated cricket, which does happen a lot in Australia. And then you suddenly have this sort of movement that he keeps picking up gigs, and obviously he's done very, very well. But even so, it doesn't feel like Mark Howard is being set up to be the next big presenter or anything else. And so we keep seeing cricketers pushed in that direction. And the problem is that, when Harsha questions a cricketer about something, it's usually of a much higher level because Harsha has a journalistic brain, right? And there are cricketers with journalistic brains. Mike Atherton is a perfect example of that. But it's still not quite the same. And I still think that cricketers don't always talk the way that they should for the audience because they're just so used to dumbing it down. Whereas sometimes actually you need that high level talk. Some of the things that, I've done TalkSport with Gareth Batty. Some of the things that Gareth Batty have said, and even Steve Harmison have said, just in passing, is so revolutionary because there's been either me or Neil Manthorpe or, John Norman poking them as journalists, right? And you hear this on the radio a lot. And then we get to the TV and we get this sort of generic wisdom put across. And you have this sort of, and Simon Doole's really interesting. Occasionally he would just stop and break it down. And you're like, and Ian Bishop started doing that as well, which I think is really, really interesting. But too often it's just generic cricket phrases thrown out. So the audience don't like it. The hardcore audience don't like it because they know more. And the new fans don't understand it. And so we're in this middle thing. And that's where you need broadcasters and journalists and independent voices to bring these things together. And former players can be absolutely brilliant. But if you're just getting star former players, you're not even picking from the best broadcasters from the players, right? So, yeah, it's not. I don't think it's a perfect situation we're in at the moment. That's for sure. But yeah, I do think it comes as much as anything from on top, and it's a safer option if you pick. I don't know. So Samuel Badgery, I thought was brilliant from the first time I heard him. It's taken him a long time to break in, right? Because even though he won 2 World Cups, he wasn't a huge name, right? In the way that Chris Gayle or Kieran Pollard would have been, and so we almost missed out on a very good commentator because he wasn't at that level. And whereas we've had other commentators who've never become good, but have a big name. And I think that's a real issue for the sport. But I do think the biggest problem, and I've said this from the start, is that cricket commentators don't take their job all that seriously because they do it for a couple of months and they don't do it for a couple of months. Then they do it for a couple of weeks and they don't do it for a couple of weeks. And they're doing it for this broadcaster who wants it this way and this broadcaster who wants it the other way. Whereas if you look at the great broadcast, teams around the world, these are people who do it for 8 months of the year or 6 months of the year, full time, with a producer, with a director, pushing, educating, getting better, trying to make the best product they're doing. And cricket just doesn't do that. For me, it doesn't really matter if you've got ex-players or not at that point. You're just not doing what you can to make the broadcast the best that it can possibly be. Anyway, we'll take a quick break, and when we're back, more questions here on the Wagon Wheel. If you have always wanted to turn your passion for sports into a career, well, I have the course for you. Fans with Laptops is the multimedia course that I came up with after millions of reads, views, and listens to all my work. It's designed for anyone to use their own fandom to get better at making content on the sport they love. Go to Fans with Laptops today. If me talking live about cricket is not enough, we also have an entire channel dedicated to the best stories in cricket called Good Areas. Find out what matchups really mean, understand the logic behind Bazball, and look at the most important selection in the history of cricket of Basil D'Oliveira. Come and visit us a couple of times a week on the Good Areas channel for a new video. All right, welcome back. Anirudh says, who are some players I think you're coasting off one iconic innings or performance, and vice versa, who had a famously terrible performance which ruins their rep? I love Ben Simmons and that missed dunk over Trey. I don't know if it quite works the same way. I mean, there's probably some T20 players who got a lot of contracts on the back of 1 or 2 good series. And you also have the statistical one too, where a player will start really, really good, like Adam Voges, right? And so you stop looking at all the other issues within their game. I think Mike Hussey was a really good example of that. And then he found another level later in his career when he was maybe not wasn't looking like getting dropped, but was starting to move into a conversation where he could be dropped. And so you get in cricket that numbers, that weight of number, right? Where the Dawid Malan thing of, well, he's made all these runs in this one thing, so therefore he is great. And so we don't then want to question anything else about them. Whereas, with Harry Brook at the moment, I was asked on TalkSport, is Harry Brook potentially going to be better than Root? It's like, the first time I saw Joe Root face a ball in Nagpur in England team, obviously I'd seen him play for Yorkshire a little bit as an opening bowler in T20 cricket. But, I'd seen Root a little bit before, but once I saw him in a test game, face whatever he made 60 in that innings, I was like, well, there's a 10-year player. I don't feel that for Brook, right? But Brook's numbers are currently better than anything at the start of Joe Root's career, which means that conversations about Brook are going to be harder to have because people are going to point back to that average. That's generally what I find. And that was the same. I had the same thing with Mike Hussey. I'm trying to think, there's another cricketer as well. Where you're looking at them and you're going, yeah, it's absolutely fantastic, but, So I think that's probably the more likely one that we see in cricket rather than one iconic innings or performance. It's usually a string, maybe some good matchups early on in your career, maybe some poor opponents early on in your career, which allows you to get to a position where you have good numbers. And then even as you chip away at those good numbers, people don't really look at it. I mean, the Ben Simmons one, the most famous version of that in cricket is Damien Martin. Was going to be a future Australian captain, played a bizarre innings in the fourth innings at Sydney when chasing, 115, 17, whatever Australia were chasing. Everyone else had collapsed. He batted forever. And then suddenly, when they were on the verge of winning, tried to punch one really through the offside and hit the ball straight to cover point and was caught. The funny thing about that is, a generation later, Stephen Fleming was setting those fields for him because it was seen as his strength. But at that stage, we didn't know a lot about Damien Martin, and it was seen as an odd shot for a player to play. It was his shot, right? I'm not saying it was a good innings, but not many Australians played a good innings in that fourth, and they didn't lose a big chunk of their career. That's a really famous one for me. You sometimes see bowlers, when they're over 30, struggle in one particular innings, and that sort of haunts them for a long time. So I think there's probably a few of those. But the Damien Martin one, I think, is one of the more interesting stories we've ever seen of a player who was probably robbed of, Australia was probably robbed of another 5 or 6 years of Damien Martin on one overreaction to what was everyone playing a really bad innings. Anurad says, what's the stats read on VBS? Always thought his reputation was carried by that innings, and that he was probably the least impactful of that so-called Big Five, along with Ganguly. Yeah, his stats aren't as impressive as Sehwag, Tendulkar, or Dravid, obviously. Those three are in a completely different level. I spent a lot of time talking to a lot of players, like teammates of Laxman and opposition members, about him for my book, and everyone kind of came across the same thing, that he underperformed. I don't think that he was carried just by that innings, because he played some other fantastic innings. He won another game for India against Australia, and played another great innings against Australia. And being that Australia were the best team he went up against in his career, I think you have to weigh all that quite heavily. I think he probably got a little... The general consensus was that VVS Laxman was probably a number 4 in a side that had Sachin Tendulkar. And quite often he would bat at number 5. And of course, they wanted one left-hander in the top order. So quite often he would bat at number 6. So now you're in a position where you've got a guy who is incredibly talented, and I haven't checked his median entry point, but my guess is that he probably came in with a score between 180 and 210 in the majority of his tests, batting at number 6. And even when he batted at number 5, it's probably 150 to 180. That's huge, right? So Gilchrist came in with a score even higher than that, but I would guess that Gilchrist and Laxman, of the players who have a genuine say to be top 50 of all time, those are probably the two guys that came in with the biggest cushion ahead of them. Sobers might have been in that frame a little bit, although Sobers batted a little bit more all over the order as well. So is there a possibility that a player as talented as Laxman, who could play any shot that he wanted to at any stage, also was a little bit bored by the position that he played in? Probably, right? He probably would have been a lot more challenged had he been a number 4, which is what his skills were probably most suited towards. But he's still a fantastic player. He was certainly a lot more of an impactful player than Ganguly. I don't think that's even close. But he's a distance back from Sehwag as well, in that sort of top, that Big Five that you're talking about. Is it Big Five? Have I got the numbers right? Yeah, Big 5. Ali says, what are some of the blind spots that you recently realized you had while covering cricket analytically? I don't know. It's such an evolving process, and I get asked this question a lot, like, what's the thing? But you're changing your opinion so much all the way through. Have I got writing on my head? The hell is that? Look at that on my forehead. Sorry, everyone listening on the podcast, like, what is he talking about? Yeah, I think there are certainly some there are just so many things that I have changed about. There are some things that I think originally when I looked at analytics, I probably thought I was originally wrong at, and now I'm more back on those sides. But it's such a constantly evolving topic, and I'm learning things all the time that are changing the way that I think about things. And the whole betting and trading side of things, which obviously I've been doing for a while now as well, has again changed the way I think about things. You put money on the line and suddenly analytics make a lot more sense from that point of view. But also you realize what you're not finding in analytics that perhaps you do need to find and everything else. So yeah, I do think there is an issue there with that. But yeah, I mean, individually, it's almost an impossible question to answer, because on a day-by-day basis, I'm trying to get better and evolve and learn more things. So everything is probably the answer. Ruja says, in the 2010 IPL, Mumbai had Malinga, Bravo, Zahir Khan, and Dilhara Fernando in their squad. Is this the greatest slow ball team ever? Ignoring that probably rarely all of them played in the same side. Malinga, Bravo, Zahir Khan. So what would be a better one? I always liked it when Gloucester must have had Harvey in. Did Gloucester have Harvey, Ty, and Hal? No, because Ty comes well after Harvey, doesn't he? But Harvey would have been the coach. So that would have been an interesting one. But I do think that Andrew Ty and Benny Howe played together. So you'd have to have a look if there were any other players who came through there that were also very well known for slower balls at that time. But I think I'm right in saying that. But yeah, this certainly looks like one of the other ones. I mean, what would you need? You'd need someone like Dernbach, Hal, and Bhatia to all play in the same side or something to sort of get to that kind of level. Ben says, Australia and South Africa in test coverage, you can often hear the fielders, sometimes clearly, sometimes not enough to make out the words, but you can hear them. Watching Sky, you cannot hear anything from the stump mics outside the bat taps and feet sounds. Is that a deliberate production choice from Sky? Do they manually turn down the stump mics between deliveries so we don't hear any of the chat? Yeah, so funnily enough, I'm about to sign on to a big project about Kerry Packer. And so I've been doing a lot of looking at World Series cricket and everything else. And the first season of World Series cricket, I don't have the numbers here, but off the top of my head, I think there was 17 occasions of the word shit going out, 13 bastards. What was the other one that went out a few times? And then a couple of fucks and one cunt. Right, that was like, it was literally, they just kept getting swear words go out on the air to the point where we thought it was going to be a big issue. I don't think I worked for them, where they thought it was going to be a big issue that they were going to get, in trouble with the regulators because there were so many swear words coming out. So there's always that sort of mix of how you do it. And, there have been things said into the stump mics that have been libelous. There have been things that have been said into the stump mics that are offensive. There are things that have been said into the microphone. What's the other one? Libelous, offensive. That just the public doesn't need to know about, right? And so the people who mix the microphone up and down are conscious of all that and are trying to do it. Obviously, things slip through and everything else. I think in South Africa and Australia, they in general, there's a little bit more of a tolerance to saying things on mic. Whereas in England, obviously, the regulations in England are so tight. Like, when I worked for TalkSport or when I was on BBC, you almost can't say anything that is without there being an issue. I've probably told this story before, but we were talking once about cricketers on air, and I was on the BBC and we just interviewed Merv Hughes. And they were saying, oh, Jarrod, you said this, but Merv said this. And I said, yeah, but in his day, all the players were always on the piss anyway. It's a completely different world to what we're talking about now. And I just said it casually, a thing that I would say 1,000 times in any sort of conversation. And the BBC had to apologize for what I said, right? And I've said other things that TalkSport have had to, dump and all sorts of things before. So that is the truth of that situation. They are very different countries. I wonder if it's the regulations that have as much to do with it as anything else. But yeah, and also it might be a broadcast issue, just in general of, maybe Sky don't like it as much as other people do. Let's have another quick break, and then we'll be back with more questions on Wagon. If you need a VPN, go Nord. Use nordvpn.com/Kimber to get a 2-year contract with a discount, plus 4 extra months, plus gifts in some markets. It's completely risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. The link is in the show notes. Protect your computer like a blocker protects the stumps with NordVPN today. Celebrate your cricket heroes with Bodyline t-shirts. Explore their player-inspired tees, featuring legends like Sachin Tendulkar, Brian Lara, and Viv Richards. They also have team-inspired designs and options for hardcore cricket nerds. Their collection is a must-have for the true cricket enthusiast. Didier says, India will play 10 tests in Australia and England over the next year. During the last tours, they use Shardul as a 5th bowler who could bat a bit. Assuming that they don't go back during this time, what approach can they take? Playing the extra batter or 5 bowlers or playing someone like Washington Sundar? Yeah, I suppose there's also Hardik. What's his name? The young guy from Sunrise. Why can I not ever remember his name? Do I mean... Yeah, Nitish Reddy. God, there's something about his name that won't go into my brain correctly. But I wouldn't have thought that they would make a place on there. And I'm assuming Hardik's not going to play. Then the other way of doing this, of course, is through second spinner. So, maybe you try someone like Washington that way. I'm just going to go out on a limb. 4 bowlers is also okay. I think some teams just get really obsessed with the fact that they can make it 5 bowlers. It's better, don't get me wrong. But Australia and the West Indies essentially had 4 frontline bowlers each who did 90% of the work. And they were really good teams. Cam says, what's your take on the removal of East Asia Pacific from having an automatic qualification spot for the T20 World Cup? Makes it hard for PNG to qualify to the benefit of, say, UAE or Hong Kong, but a step away from true regional qualification. Yeah, I think cricket's in a weird spot in that, and we've seen this before in football, right? Like at times where you kind of have to... you kind of want regional qualifications, but it doesn't work because of the strength of the sides. And remember when I think the Pacific region in football only had half a spot guaranteed to them. And so Australia moved into the Asia group and, requested to move into the Asian group and play there. So you do get a position there where it's probably not ideal. I thought they probably stepped to the regional qualification a little bit too early anyway. But I think a balance between trying to get the best teams and a regional representation is great. I don't think the PNG should automatically, and not that they would, obviously Vanuatu is coming up and some of the other sides are coming up, but I don't think the PNG should automatically qualify just because there's no other good sides. And I think if you've got a system that you're doing that, that's also not working. But you do want a broad, representation because it's more of a World Cup at that point. Ben says, when working out averages, would runs per innings be a fair reflection of batter's impact on a game rather than runs per dismissal? Why was it chosen to be based on dismissal? Well, runs per innings is massively weighted by your batting position, right? So Rahul Dravid made more runs per test match than Sachin Tendulkar, probably because he had more innings and because he batted slightly higher. So, runs per innings, I don't think would work. Like it would be very hard for us to tell. It would make all the best players look like they bat 1, 2, and 3, which is not exactly true, right? So I don't think that's an accurate way of doing it, and I wouldn't be backing that. I think average over a long period of time works, but average is just one part of it, Ben. We look at match ratios, we look at era ratios. There's people like CricViz have their what's it called? The average based on the Hawkeye data and everything else. Like, average is just one way of doing it, and it's a good start. But an overall average, I think it's a... Wait a minute. Let me see if I can find the cricketer. So, is it Everton Weeks I'm looking for? Everton Weeks averages 58 in Test cricket, right? And you break that... No, it's not Everton Weeks I was looking for. Start again. Is it Walcott? Yeah, so Clyde Walcott, here we go. Yeah, so he averages 56 in Test cricket. And away from home, he averages 40. And in those away from home matches, oh God, I can't find it now. But I think the more you break it down, like he averages 14 in Australia, 34 in England, and then averaged 64 in India and 66 in New Zealand. So the further you get into his career, the more you realize that he was absolutely brilliant at home against, pretty much everyone, right? No one has any issue with that. But he didn't make any runs in the 3 tests he played in Australia, and he didn't make any runs in the 9 tests he played in England. And he mostly made runs against the weaker sides that he went up against. Like he averaged 96 against a young Pakistan side at that stage, right? So we were already looking beyond his normal average anyway. That's the future. It's just not stopping at average. Adityan says, there's been a lot of discussion around switch hit not being acceptable since a right-hand batter is becoming a left-hander all of a sudden. The counter argument is bowlers should be let to change hands without informing the umpire. However, bowlers could still try to be Paul Adams and flip over the ball from the back. Will that be easier to master than being ambidextrous? And also change the angle drastically to the batter? Yeah, well, bowlers can do stuff like that. I don't think that's a very natural movement. But I think obviously I was kind of the meat in the Harsha KP sandwich on this one, which is me and Harsha probably both broadly agree here. We actually don't have any problem with the switch hit. We don't really understand why a bowler needs to tell you what arm they're going to bowl with. If a batter doesn't need to tell you what side of the bat they're going to stand up. I also think once you decide to bat right hand or left hand, you forfeit your leg stump. So in other words, from an LBW perspective, you've changed what leg stump now is. So you no longer have a leg stump, and on both sides, it should be off stump. Little things like that, I think are completely fair once you do that. And the same with wides. You can no longer, you now have an offside wide on both sides of your body. You've decided to change how you're standing. And so that's done. The problem with the letting a bowler pick whichever arm they're going to bowl with is essentially it's going to be a very hard skill for any bowler. Now, I'm not saying like 5 or 6 won't do it, but generally it's going to be a very hard skill for any bowler to fake which arm they're going to come in with and then still bowl an international quality ball or a T20 quality ball. And I think that's the issue with why it's not ideal. Sam says, having taken a well-deserved holiday, please take this opportunity to give Kevin Hodge his flowers. Most runs of the West Indies and best bowling average too. Look, we talked about it on the podcast the other day. Look, Hodgie is, I've worked with a lot of cricketers now, as in, within the team. And it's a little bit different than just having friendships with them through the media. And I just think he's one of the special ones. And I remember catching up with him. He might be playing for the university side. And I saw him on the boundary. He's just a really excitable, nice guy. And I think the world got to see that. And I'm so glad that he got his moment. And I think this is probably life-changing for him. And he worked hard to change his life. Well done. Couldn't be more happy for him. Jessica says, Brian Lara had a really horrible mid-career slump. From 1996 to 2002, his test career batting average dropped from 60 to 47. There was lots of struggle, failure, and unhappiness, with only the occasional moment of his old epic heroism. His career path would have ended a sad, pathetic whimper, much like Richie Richardson or Jimmy Adams, but he didn't give up and he kept going. And yeah, he had a glorious late career boom. How do I think he was able to do this? Because he's probably the most naturally talented batter since Bradman or Sobers. Is one way he managed to do it. The other one is, I just don't think he was taking his cricket as seriously as he should have been. And I think he's been quite honest and open with that at times. Cricket was just a part of his life in a way that it never was for, say, someone like Sachin Tendulkar. And there's a long period of Brian Lara's career where I just don't think it mattered as much to him as it probably did. And then he started to see his legacy failing. And I think that was the issue with him. And then he stepped back up. Lara could have averaged 60 in Test cricket, right? But motivation is all part of it. How you motivate yourself each and every day is a part of it. And Sachin Tendulkar and Jack Hobbs and Don Bradman motivated themselves every single day. Steve Smith motivates himself every single day. And Brian Lara is as talented and more talented than some of the players I just mentioned. He doesn't have that. And it takes everything to get to that level. And when Lara put it on, then he dominated again. Jessica again says, over the past 25 years, innumerable journalists and commentators have argued that the reason we have so many one-sided test matches in favour of the home sides is because of the reduction in proper tour preparation, both... Oh, wait. Oh, I think we're missing the end of our question. But I think our question is, how do we actually look into that? Look, the biggest reason that we've had home sides dominate a lot more in recent times is the lack of draws. You start taking draws out, and all of those draws have been replaced by the home team winning, like almost right across the board. That's a far bigger factor than the preparation. But the truth is that in the old days, you would play 7 or 8 games. I don't know how you test it, Jessica, but the truth, I can't see how that wouldn't be a better preparation. If you're playing 30 games in England and 5 of them are tests, right? There is the general exhaustion because your cricketers aren't used to playing that much cricket, which does come from it. But geez, you're going to know how to play cricket in England by the end of that tour, right? If you're playing 5 matches in England, 4 of them are tests, and 1 is a warm-up game that might not even come before the first game, you can't be hitting the ground running in English conditions in the same way. I'd find it hard to think that there wouldn't be a correlation. But the bigger issue in away teams struggling is the lack of draws. Simon Nathan says, theoretically, a top EFL footballer could end up playing 86 games for club and country, and there's a rightful mutiny in the soccer world about this. What's a sustainable amount of cricket that an average athlete can play and not be injured because of overwork? I know fast bowlers and batsmen are the same. Yeah, it's probably around that 80-85 mark as well, I would have thought. I think if you're getting up to 100, you're talking about playing a day's worth of cricket every 3 days. And at that point, it's just tough on you physically. As well as mentally. Plus, the travel in cricket is a lot more excruciating than most other sports. You know, tennis and golf are the only two that really sort of compare, I think, when it comes to just how often you are not at home and for how long you are not at home for. I mean, if you're a golfer and a tennis player, you almost don't live at home, right? If you're a cricket player, you kind of don't live at home. So I do think that there's a huge part of that that plays a part. But yeah, I would have thought around that 85 mark makes sense. I think cricketers can physically play more cricket than that, whether they could be at their best. Fast bowlers, it's probably 60, would be my guess. But again, not sure that anyone's going to be in a rush to do that. All right, let's take another quick break, and then we'll come back and we'll see if there's any super chats in the room. I'm Jarrod Kimber. This is the Wagon Wheel, and you should buy my book. In fact, here's an ad about my book. I have a book out with Abhishek Mukherjee, and it is called Overthrowing Cricket's Empire. And it's about the stories of how each team beat England for the first time. We go all the way back to the demon Fred Spofforth getting annoyed at W.G. Grace for acting a little bit like Alex Carey. And then we come all the way to present times with Rashid Khan's England's redemption. We cover every single team to beat England in a major international, but we also talk about the incredible stories, like the barefoot basher from Fiji that almost played for New Zealand. In fact, this book is full of tales like that, like how Pakistan lost a top batter after he was on the run from an angry husband of a movie star he was having an affair with, and also how one future captain of his nation realised he might have to go out and bat at Lords and that he didn't own his own pads. Cricket was used as a tool by the Empire, but what happens when those nations grow up and get good at it? Find Overthrowing Cricket's Empire on Amazon today. Welcome back. We've got a couple of super chats, and then I'm probably going to go off and watch Australia hopefully beat Canada, but probably lose to Canada in the men's basketball. eCount says, what pieces that you've written come out the best? It's generally just about the time, right? Like, I'm sure I've written very good pieces from grounds, but generally the ones from the grounds, when I go back and read them, they're just a little bit rough. Because I remember someone saying once, oh, Jarrod Kimber, he's a fine writer, but he's not like a proper literary great, with his writing. And he cited some article that I'd written, and it was an okay written article, but he had a point. It was like, yeah, I had 3 hours to write 2,000 words, right? Just saying, when I write a book, I can have 3 weeks to write 2,000 words at times, right? Completely different world. I thought Archie was probably the piece I worked the longest on, Shahid Afridi of Kansas, in many different ways. And that was really heavily edited by me and by other people. And most of my work hasn't been heavily edited. Unfortunately, in the modern online world, you kind of either have to learn to edit yourself, which is a tough skill to master, But that was certainly a piece. You know, I love the Asif Kareem piece would be another one. The Sean Tate piece. Those are probably the ones that instantly come to my mind. Oh, Aubrey Faulkner would be another one. You know, the Neil Wagner one was certainly one that I spent a lot of time on. That's probably not a written piece, it's a video piece. And the Basil D'Oliveira racism podcast for Double Century was another one that you know, I really, you know, I sweated over the lines. And as a sports writer, you don't often get the chance to do that. You learn a lot of skills sports writing of how to write even on the worst days possible, and how to make things interesting when they're not always interesting, and all these sorts of great skills. But the one problem is it does become a churn, and it does affect the actual quality of your writing. So when you get a chance, you put all in. So, you know, I'm really happy with The Art of Cricket, but I've only done the first draft of The Art of Batting, sorry. But I've only done the first draft of that one, and I would love to go over that before. And obviously, you know, the books over here, Overthrowing Cricket's Empire, was another one that's probably been written 3 times. So some of those chapters are really so tight because of that. You know, in a way that you don't get the opportunity to always do with normal work. And how do you seek use feedback? Look, most feedback is rubbish. Most people are just upset at one particular thing that you've said and haven't really read the entire piece. Most feedback misses the point of what the article or the book, the video was about in the first place. I think the ones I always look for, that because I know that I have issues with them, is I think I don't like to be patronizing, but I'm trying to tell the story of how incredibly someone has overcome something. You want to, or a team has overcome something, you want to do that, but you also don't want to do it in a way that makes it feel like you're patronizing them. But, you know, when you look at Australia dominating sport, or Sri Lanka winning a World Cup, it's like, these are not global players, and yet. And so I want to tell the story accurately in a dramatically factual way, but also I don't want to be patronizing to, I cannot believe this person from country Victoria has met, do you know what I mean? And I think I sometimes struggle with that. The other one that I had a problem with early in my career, which I took a lot, was padding. I was so determined to tell everyone that I knew everything about cricket that I put extra stuff in. And if you have a look at my first book, sorry, not my first book, my second book, which is When Freddie Became Jesus, there's so much in it before the series starts. And some of it's really good and interesting, but it could have just been pared back or used to tell the stories during the series, right? Like, I think about that book right now, and I remember talking about Stuart Broad, but I think I would talk about Stuart Broad and the Netherlands game at the start of the World Cup. Sorry, at the start, before the Ashes. Because actually, when he takes that spell at the Oval, that's the perfect time to tell the story about him in that same summer losing the game to the Netherlands. But I didn't do that. So padding was a problem early in my career. That's not a problem anymore. I'm certainly not trying to make anything longer anymore. And, you know, people, and also you come to a certain point where, like, you're either going to accept me as someone who knows about cricket or you're not. And then the other one I would say is, you know, cultural biases, gender biases, able-bodied biases, straight bias, all those sorts of things I think are really, really interesting. And you, as a writer, you're learning them. And also, you see older writers get, even writers my age, get really upset of like, oh, you can't say this anymore. And you can't. No, then you have to learn and adapt. That's how it works, right? And it's like, oh, you couldn't make this TV show anymore. Well, no, you couldn't make most old TV shows anymore because TV's changed. You would have to make something different. That is how it always worked. And so I find those things really interesting. And the other thing for me is clarity. Like, if I'm giving my piece to someone to read and they say this bit wasn't clear, that's the bit I'm going to work on the most. Saurabh says, if England and Australia play a 5-test series in India, who wins? Also, which is more difficult for India? India defeating England in Australia, or India defeating Australia in England? Oh, Jesus. Well, Australia's a better team and they have Nathan Lyon, so you would go with them over England at the moment. I think that's pretty straightforward. I'm not sure they win easily, though. Also think their seam bowlers, certainly as it stands without Jimmy Anderson, are much more suited to bowling in Asia than England's bowlers are. It might be different in a couple of years, but as that lineups are at the moment. Which is more difficult for England? India defeating England in Australia, or India defeating... Well, at the moment, I think India's just a better team than England by a considerable margin. So I would assume they would beat them in Australia because they've had success in Australia. I think India defeating Australia in England would be very tough based on the matchup right at the moment. Laughing at Nothing says, Ireland versus Zimbabwe test showed how smaller teams playing tests can be very entertaining. Unlike England versus West Indies third test. How did the ICC incentivize them to play more tests as they seem talented enough to be competitive? Well, the ICC doesn't run test cricket. So why would they incentivize them to play more tests? It's not in their best interest. ICC don't make any more money if Ireland and Zimbabwe play test cricket. I'm trying to think, maybe it's on the ICC's global feed, but even then, I don't think the ICC would care all that much from that point of view. So no, I think I don't really see how that's massively going to help anyone. Look, the best way of doing it was a few years ago. We have 7 teams in Tier 1, and we have 7 teams in Tier 2. We have 7 teams in Tier 3. That's Test cricket, and then anyone else can play Test cricket if they want, but they have to fight to get into Tier 3 for it to be called a major test. And then we have division tests, and then teams who are 6th and 7th have to play teams who are, 8th and 9th to go up and down and all these sorts of things. That's what we could have done, but we didn't do that. And so, I mean, it's not like we just learned today that an Ireland versus Zimbabwe test could be interesting, because we've had smaller teams play each other and be interesting before. Was it Afghanistan, Ireland as well of recent times? Just that no one's in charge, mate, is the best way of putting it. Indigo says, is LeBron still the best player in the USA? How does he keep doing it even at this age? I think LeBron, for something like Team USA, I don't know why we got onto basketball here, but I think for someone like that, you have to... The championship that he won last with the Lakers was the lockout season when he was well rested. They won the in-season tournament, which was early on when he hadn't put as many miles in. And Team USA is coming on the back of him being rested a little bit, right? I'm not... It's hard. It's not like his skills or his knowledge have disappeared massively. He may not quite be the athlete he once was, but he's still a better athlete than most people will ever dream of being, right? And so... he just needs to be able to, do his skill sets. And it's a bit, this actually follows into the kind of the Jimmy Anderson thing, right? If Jimmy Anderson was still forced to play ODI cricket and was still playing T20 League cricket, we wouldn't have seen Jimmy Anderson in his 40s be a good test bowler, right? The reason that Jimmy Anderson is a good test bowler in his 40s was in part in the way his genetics, in part because he just wanted to keep bowling the next ball, but in a large part because in his 30s, he wasn't over bowled, right? And LeBron James, when he is well rested, is as good as anyone. Over an 82-game season, he's going to get tired, especially because the Lakers have been absolute trash around him most of the time. So he has to carry more of a load. We saw the Nuggets lose last year in part because the star players were exhausted by the time they got to the playoffs. The players get tired, and we see it again and again, and we discount it. And so LeBron James, if LeBron James only had to play 15 games, what is that in the NBA Finals? Let's say he only had to play 25 games a year, and you could guarantee that the Lakers were going to come 5th, right? And then you could just unleash him for those last 32 games. They might win a couple more championships, right? But it's not how professional sport works. And so when he's rested, he looks good, and when he's not rested, he doesn't look good. There's plenty of fast bowlers that you could put on the exact same metrics as LeBron there. Anyway, I am off probably to watch basketball or do something else. I'm Jarrod Kimber. This is the Wagon Wheel. Thank you to everyone who commented all the way through. Sorry I didn't have time to go through all the different comments today, but I see Sid in there, and obviously Varun and Tino and Daksh was there as well, who asked, will there be a paperback version of my book? I assume so, but I would only if we sell enough copies of the hardcover one to start with, but there will be a Kindle version as well. But I am Jarrod Kimber, and this is the Wagon Wheel, and I will be back again soon for more of these kinds of shenaniganizing. Shenaniganizing? Am I happy with that? Pretty happy with that. Remember that cricket is a funny game. 100 years before we protected our heads, players looked after their groin. So don't be as stupid as old cricketers. Protect your computer. NordVPN is the protection I use when facing cyber shortballs or when the rights issue tried to dismiss me. NordVPN will help you get through the straight bat of any GEO blocks so you can watch all the cricket you want. If you need your pitch changed, well, NordVPN can doctor any surface to a new location so your IP address is set up for you to win. Want to buy an associate cricket shirt from a place that won't ship to your country? Select NordVPN. Want to watch a game on a free stream in another hemisphere? Give NordVPN the ball. Or if you just want to watch a clip on social media that the cricket board won't allow, promote NordVPN to pinch it. So if you need a VPN, go Nord. Use nordvpn.com/Kimber to get a huge discount off your NordVPN plan plus 4 additional months for free. It's completely risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. The link is in the show notes. Protect your computer like a cricketer protects their nether region with NordVPN today.